some doors should never be opened. Marcus Chen had worked the night shift at the FBI's Federal Plaza building for 7 years, mopping floors and emptying trash bins in the labyrinthine corridors that most agents never saw. He thought he knew every room, every closet, every forgotten corner of the massive complex until that October night when his master keycard malfunctioned on sublevel B7. The error led him to a service elevator he'd never noticed before, one that descended 2 floors deeper than any blueprint showed. The vault, he discovered, bore no official markings, just a faded red stamp reading "Classified." "Do not open," and 3 thick manila folders inside, each containing investigations that would make you question everything you thought you knew about the nature of reality itself. Tonight, I'll share these 3 cases that the FBI buried so deep they forgot they existed. Stories that will crawl into your mind and nest there like parasites feeding on your sanity. You might think you understand horror, but these aren't fiction. They're documented evidence of things that hunt in the shadows of our world, wearing the faces of nightmares we thought were just dreams. If you're brave enough to hear what Marcus found, subscribe to this channel because some truths are too dangerous to let die in forgotten vaults, and someone needs to bear witness to the darkness that surrounds us every night. Before we begin, let me ask you something that will make sense once you've heard all 3 stories. Have you ever woken up feeling like someone else had been wearing your body while you slept? The first person to answer correctly will receive a small reward from me, the storyteller tonight, as a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. I'm curious to know where in the world you're watching this and what time it is for. You right now, because time zones might matter more than you think for what's coming next. Now then, let me tell you about the night Marcus Chen opened that vault and discovered that some secrets are classified not to protect national security, but to protect our collective sanity from truths that should never see daylight. The first file Marcus pulled from the vault was labeled Case 001, Operation Sandman, with a date stamp from October 1994, and as he opened it under the flickering fluorescent lights of sublevel B9, the photographs that spilled out made his hands shake. So violently he nearly dropped them all. The images showed bedroom after bedroom across Queens, each containing entire families lying peacefully in their beds with their eyes missing, not torn out or surgically removed, but simply absent, leaving behind smooth skin where the sockets should have been. Detective Sarah Walsh's handwritten notes described the first incident on Elmhurst Avenue, where the Morrison family was discovered by their mailman after 3 days of uncollected mail. 4 bodies arranged in perfect sleeping positions with no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no evidence of violence except for those impossible empty sockets that seemed to have sealed themselves overnight. The medical examiner's report, signed by Dr. Elizabeth Reyes, documented that each victim's brain showed signs of intense REM sleep activity at the time of death, as if they had died while experiencing the most vivid dreams of their lives. Within 2 weeks, 7 more families across different neighborhoods in Queens were found in identical circumstances, and that's when the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was called in to investigate what local police were calling the sleep harvest. Killings. Agent Robert Martinez's psychological profile suggested they were dealing with something unprecedented. Not a serial killer in any conventional sense, but an entity that fed on specific brain chemistry produced during deep sleep cycles. The breakthrough came when Dr. Reyes discovered that all victims had reported identical nightmares to their doctors, friends, and family members in the weeks leading up to their deaths, dreams of a tall figure standing at the foot of their beds, with holes where its face should be, watching them sleep and whispering promises of eternal rest. The most disturbing detail in the file was a handwritten note from Agent Martinez that read, "We found 17 survivors who reported the same dreams but lived, and every single one of them claims the figure spoke to them in a voice they recognized as their own, saying the words 'I'm coming home soon,' and when they looked in mirrors the next morning, their reflection had no eyes for exactly 37 seconds before returning to normal." Dr. Patricia Vance, the FBI's consulting sleep specialist, had set up monitoring equipment in 3 separate locations across Queens after interviewing the 17 survivors, and what her recordings captured defied every scientific principle she thought she understood about human consciousness and the nature of dreaming itself. The audio files in the case folder contained hours of seemingly normal sleep sounds, breathing patterns, and occasional movement, until precisely 3:17 a.m., when each recording erupted into the most terrifying sounds Marcus had ever heard, not screams of fear, but screams of recognition, as if the sleepers were encountering something they had been expecting their entire lives. Dr. Vance's analysis notes described how the brainwave patterns of monitored subjects showed impossible activity during these episodes, with their minds somehow accessing memories and experiences that belonged to other people, other times, other places entirely. The most chilling recording came from Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, a 62-year-old grandmother whose monitor captured her speaking in perfect Victorian English about streets that hadn't existed in New York for over a century, describing in vivid detail the construction of buildings that were demolished decades before she was born. Agent Martinez's follow-up investigation revealed that Mrs. Rodriguez was somehow accessing the memories of Sarah Whitmore, a woman who had died in her sleep. In 1897, in the exact same location where Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment building now stood. The photographs Dr. Vance took during these episodes showed subjects' eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids, but when she used infrared imaging, she discovered something that made her request immediate transfer off the case. The heat signatures showed a second figure standing beside each bed, a tall shape with no body temperature at all, leaning down as if whispering directly into the sleeper's ear. The final page of this section contained a hand-drawn sketch by Dr. Vance showing the figure's approximate position and dimensions, with a note written in increasingly erratic handwriting that read, "It's not visiting them in their dreams. It's using their dreams as doorways to harvest something from their minds. And I think it's been doing this for centuries, moving from one location to another, feeding on whatever it finds behind our sleeping eyes, and God help me, I think it knows I'm watching because now I'm having the dreams too, and in them I can see my own empty eye sockets reflecting in its face that isn't a face." The pattern that emerged from Agent Martinez's investigation was more terrifying than random killings because it suggested intelligence, planning, and a hunger that followed rules no human mind could comprehend, feeding every 28 days with the precision of a lunar cycle that had remained unbroken for decades. Marcus traced his finger along the timeline Martinez had constructed, showing disappearances dating back to 1962, each cluster occurring in the same neighborhoods but shifting location every few years as if the entity understood it was being hunted and had learned to adapt its hunting grounds accordingly. The witness statements collected from survivors revealed a disturbing consistency in their descriptions of the figure, all mentioning its impossible height, the way it seemed to bend and fold rather than walk, and, most unnervingly, how it appeared. To know intimate details about their lives that no one else could possibly know, speaking to them in voices of dead relatives and lost loves. Mrs. Chen, an 84-year-old survivor from Flushing, told Agent Martinez that the figure had spoken to her in her late husband's voice, telling her secrets they had shared 40 years ago, promising to reunite them in eternal sleep if she would just stop fighting the dreams and let her eyes go dark. The most revealing testimony came from Timothy Walsh, a 12-year-old boy who had survived when his entire family perished, and who drew pictures that perfectly matched crime scene photographs he had never seen, showing the figure's true form. Not humanoid at all, but something that wore the shape of human expectations, while its real body remained a writhing mass of shadows and hungry spaces. Agent Martinez's behavioral analysis concluded that the entity was collecting something more valuable than life itself, harvesting the specific neural patterns that contained human memory, experience, and consciousness, leaving behind empty shells that died not from physical trauma, but from the complete absence of everything that made them who they were. The case file's most disturbing revelation was hidden in a small folder labeled Historical Research, containing newspaper clippings from the 1800s describing identical deaths across Manhattan, always following the same 28-day cycle, suggesting that this thing had been feeding on sleeping New Yorkers for over a century, evolving its methods but never changing its fundamental nature as something that existed in the spaces between waking and dreaming, something that understood human consciousness better than humans understood it themselves. The lucid dreaming experiments that Dr. Vance conducted in her final weeks on the case opened a window into a realm of existence that should have remained forever closed, and the footage she recorded using specialized EEG equipment showed brain activity patterns that suggested her subjects were somehow making contact with the entity during controlled dream states. Marcus watched the grainy video recordings with growing horror as Dr. Vance guided volunteers through lucid dreaming techniques, teaching them to maintain consciousness while their bodies remained in deep sleep, not realizing she was essentially offering them as bait to something that had been hunting dreamers for over a century. The breakthrough came during session 847 with volunteer Michael Santos, a 26-year-old insomniac who had developed natural lucid dreaming abilities to cope with chronic nightmares and whose session recording captured the moment when the entity realized it was being observed. Santos's voice on the tape remained calm and clinical as he described the tall figure materializing in his dream, but his words became increasingly frantic as he realized the entity was speaking directly to Dr. Vance through him, using his vocal cords to deliver messages that made no sense in human language but carried emotional weight that felt like ice water in Marcus's veins. The entity knew it was being studied, had known all along, and had been allowing the research to continue because each lucid dreaming session gave it deeper access to the minds it sought to harvest. Dr. Vance's final notes, written in handwriting that deteriorated from professional script to desperate scrawling, described how the entity explained its feeding process. It existed in the liminal space between consciousness and unconsciousness, and could only fully manifest when a human mind achieved the perfect balance of awareness and vulnerability that occurred during lucid dreams. The most chilling discovery was that the entity didn't just steal memories and consciousness from its victims. It used those stolen elements to become more human with each feeding, learning to mimic human behavior and emotion so perfectly that it was beginning to infiltrate waking reality by impersonating its previous victims. The final video recording showed Dr. Vance's last session, where she attempted to confront the entity directly through her own lucid dreaming, and Marcus had to stop the tape when her screams of recognition echoed through the vault because she had realized too late that the figure standing beside her bed wasn't just in her dream. It was also standing behind her in the laboratory, wearing the face of her deceased sister and whispering promises of reunion in a voice that sounded exactly like her own. The second file Marcus extracted from the vault bore the classification Case 002. The Midnight Protocol, and contained audio cassette tapes that had been sealed with evidence tape dated from 1990 to 1993, each labeled with timestamps showing incoming calls to the FBI's Brooklyn field office hotline at exactly 3:17 a.m. every single night for 3 consecutive years. Special Agent Diana Foster's initial report dismissed the calls as pranks until the caller began providing detailed information about deaths that wouldn't occur until days later, speaking in a voice so distorted by static and electronic interference that even the Bureau's best audio specialists couldn't determine if it belonged to a man, woman, or something else entirely. The transcripts Marcus found showed a progression from simple death predictions to increasingly complex information about crimes that hadn't yet been committed, missing persons who were still officially alive, and details about FBI operations that were classified at levels far above what any civilian could possibly access. Agent Foster's handwriting grew more erratic as the months passed, and her reports documented her growing obsession with tracing the calls, which seemed to originate from different locations throughout Brooklyn's underground infrastructure, moving through abandoned subway stations, forgotten utility tunnels, and condemned buildings, in a pattern that suggested the caller was always on the move, yet somehow remained connected to a network of communication systems that officially didn't exist. The breakthrough came during month 18 when FBI technician Robert Kim managed to trace a call to an abandoned psychiatric hospital in Crown Heights, leading to the most disturbing discovery in the case file. The voice analysis equipment revealed that the caller's vocal patterns matched recordings of patients from the hospital's archives, specifically those who had died in 1952 during experimental treatments for what medical records described as chronic night terrors and sleep disorders. Dr. Margaret Holbrook's psychiatric notes from 1952 described patient 247 as a man who claimed he could see death approaching other patients days before they died, speaking of a figure that visited him every night at 3:17 a.m. to share visions of future deaths, and whose final words before his own death were recorded as, "The calls will continue after I'm gone, because death has given me a purpose, and I will keep warning people until someone finally listens and stops what's coming for all of us who sleep in this city." Agent Foster's investigation led her deep into the abandoned subway tunnels beneath Brooklyn, following signal traces and electromagnetic anomalies that shouldn't have existed in areas where no power had flowed for decades, yet somehow the calls continued to originate from locations that grew increasingly impossible to explain through conventional technology. The photographs in the case file showed Foster's descent into the forgotten infrastructure of New York, tunnels that appeared on no official city maps, maintenance areas that seemed to extend far beyond what was structurally possible, and evidence of recent habitation in spaces that had supposedly been sealed since the 1940s. Her field notes described finding equipment that looked like a bizarre hybrid of 1950s medical apparatus and modern telecommunications technology, jury-rigged systems that hummed with electricity despite being connected to no visible power source, and walls covered with detailed maps of the city showing the locations and dates of every death the midnight caller had predicted with terrifying accuracy. The most disturbing discovery came when Foster realized the tunnel system she was exploring corresponded exactly to the former basement levels of the psychiatric hospital where patient 247 had died, areas that had been buried during urban development but somehow remained accessible through the subway system's deepest maintenance tunnels. Dr. Kim's electronic analysis of the equipment Foster found revealed that someone or something had created a communications network that tapped directly into the city's entire telecommunications infrastructure, allowing the caller to reach any phone system in New York while remaining completely untraceable through normal investigative methods. Foster's psychological evaluation after 6 months on the case noted signs of severe sleep deprivation and increasing paranoia, particularly her obsession with answering the phone at exactly 3:17 a.m. each night, and her growing conviction that the calls were not just predictions, but warnings from someone trapped between life and death who was desperately trying to prevent more deaths from occurring. The audio recordings of her final conversations with the midnight caller showed a dramatic shift in the entity's communication style, as if it recognized Foster as someone who was finally listening, and its voice became clearer, more human, more desperate as it began revealing information about a larger pattern of death and supernatural activity spreading throughout New York's 5 boroughs like a plague that fed on human consciousness during sleep. The voice recognition analysis that Dr. Kim performed on the clearest audio samples revealed a truth so impossible that Agent Foster initially refused to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. The midnight caller's vocal patterns, speech, rhythms, and linguistic markers perfectly matched archived recordings of Thomas Brightwater, a former psychiatric patient who had died on October 13, 1952, at exactly 3:17 a.m. during an experimental treatment for severe sleep disorders and prophetic nightmares. The hospital's medical records, which Foster obtained through classified federal channels, documented that Brightwater had been admitted after claiming he could see the exact moment and manner of other people's deaths during his dreams, and that a tall figure with no face had begun visiting him nightly to share visions of future tragedies that always came true within 72 hours. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison's treatment notes from 1952 described Brightwater's final days as increasingly agitated as he insisted that his death would not stop the visions. that something was using him as a conduit to warn the living about supernatural threats they couldn't perceive, and that his spirit would be trapped in the space between life and death until someone finally understood the true nature of what was hunting people in their sleep. The psychiatric hospital's experimental treatment records showed that Brightwater had been subjected to early forms of electroshock therapy combined with experimental drugs designed to suppress his prophetic dreams, but instead of curing his condition, the treatments had somehow amplified his psychic abilities to a degree that terrified even his doctors. Foster's investigation revealed that the hospital had conducted secret experiments on over 200 patients between 1950 and 1953, trying to understand and weaponize psychic phenomena for government purposes, and that most of these patients had died under mysterious circumstances that were officially attributed to treatment complications, but showed clear signs of supernatural intervention. The most chilling discovery was that Brightwater's death had occurred during a procedure designed to permanently separate his consciousness from his physical body, an experiment that had apparently succeeded in ways the doctors never intended, leaving his awareness trapped in the liminal space between life and death, where he continued to receive visions of future deaths, but could only communicate through the primitive telecommunications equipment that had been used during his treatments. Foster's final report concluded that Thomas Brightwater's spirit had somehow learned to manipulate electromagnetic fields to make contact with the living world, using the city's phone systems to warn people about supernatural threats that were spreading through New York like a contagion that targeted human consciousness itself, and that his nightly calls at 3:17 a.m. represented his eternal punishment for having glimpsed truths that mortals were never meant to know. The final confrontation between Agent Foster and the entity known as Thomas Brightwater occurred in the deepest levels of the abandoned psychiatric hospital, where Foster followed the electromagnetic signals to their source and discovered a chamber that had been sealed since 1952, but somehow remained active with equipment that defied every law. Of physics and electronics she thought she understood. The photographs she took with infrared cameras showed a room that appeared to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously, with 1950s medical equipment functioning alongside modern computer systems that had never been installed, walls covered, with patient records that updated themselves in real time, and in the center of it all, a chair where Thomas Brightwater had died, but somehow continued to exist as a presence that could manipulate matter and energy across decades. Foster's final audio log, recorded on her personal device as backup evidence, captured her conversation with Brightwater's spirit as his voice came not from the telecommunications equipment, but from the air itself, speaking with perfect clarity about the true nature of the supernatural plague spreading through New York's sleeping population. He told her that the entity from Case 01, the thing that harvested eyes and memories from sleeping victims, was not acting alone, but was part of a larger invasion of beings from a realm where consciousness existed without physical form, and that they had been systematically targeting humans with specific psychic abilities to create doorways between dimensions. Brightwater explained that his own psychic abilities had made him a target, but the experimental treatments had accidentally trapped him in a state between life and death where he could observe the entity's activities, but could only warn people through the primitive technology that had been used to kill him. Foster's voice on the recording became increasingly strained as she realized that Brightwater's warnings about future deaths were not predictions, but desperate attempts to prevent the entities from completing their invasion of human consciousness, and that every person who died in their sleep was having their awareness harvested to fuel the opening of larger doorways between dimensions. The most terrifying revelation came when Brightwater told her that the entities had learned to wear the faces and voices of their victims so perfectly that they were beginning to replace living people without anyone noticing, and that the only way to identify them was through their complete lack of natural electromagnetic fields that living humans produced unconsciously. Foster's final words on the recording were a whispered promise to continue Brightwater's work, followed by the sound of equipment powering down and her footsteps echoing as she left the chamber. But the timestamp showed the recording continued. For another 7 minutes of silence broken only by a voice that sounded exactly like Foster saying, "I understand now. and I will help you save them all," even though Agent Foster's official death certificate showed she had died 3 days before, making that recording. The third and final case file that Marcus pulled from the vault was marked Case 003, Collective Mind Protocol, and contained psychiatric evaluations, brain scan images, and incident reports from an apartment complex in Long Island City where 43 residents had somehow begun sharing thoughts, memories, and eventually consciousness itself in a phenomenon that FBI behavioral analysts could only describe as humanity's worst nightmare made manifest. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's initial assessment report documented how the first signs appeared as minor, synchronicities among neighbors, residents finishing each other's sentences, knowing about private conversations they had never witnessed, and experiencing déjà vu so intense it left them disoriented and nauseous for hours at a time. The apartment complex, built in 1987 on the site of a former psychiatric research facility, seemed architecturally normal until FBI structural engineers discovered that the building's electrical wiring followed no standard building codes, instead forming complex geometric patterns throughout the walls that resembled neural networks more than functional electrical systems. Agent Michael Torres's investigation notes revealed that residents had initially welcomed these strange connections as a form of enhanced community bonding. But within weeks, the shared experiences escalated to complete memory fusion, where tenants would wake up with complete recollections of other people's childhoods, traumatic experiences, and intimate secrets that belonged to neighbors they had never actually met. Dr. Walsh's psychological profiles showed that residents were losing their individual identities as their minds merged into a collective consciousness that exhibited hostile behavior toward anyone who attempted to leave the building or interfere with the process of mental integration. The brain scan images included in the file showed impossible neural activity patterns where individual brains displayed synchronized wave functions that should have been physically impossible without direct physical connection between the subjects' nervous systems. The most disturbing aspect of the case was documented in Agent Torres's surveillance reports, which described how the collective consciousness began to exhibit knowledge and capabilities that no individual resident possessed, solving complex mathematical problems, speaking in languages none of them had ever learned, and demonstrating awareness of FBI surveillance techniques that were classified at levels far above civilian access. Dr. Walsh's final evaluation concluded that the apartment complex had become a testing ground for some kind of consciousness merging, technology that was either extraterrestrial in origin or represented a breakthrough in human psychological manipulation that turned individual minds into components of a single, increasingly powerful group intelligence. The collective consciousness that emerged from the Long Island City apartment complex exhibited intelligence patterns that terrified FBI behavioral analysts because it learned and adapted at an exponential rate, quickly developing strategies to spread its influence beyond the building's physical boundaries through methods that seemed to blend advanced technology with supernatural manipulation of human psychology. Dr. Walsh's research notes documented how the collective had learned to communicate with potential new hosts through the building's electrical systems, using power fluctuations and electromagnetic fields to influence the brain chemistry of visitors, delivery workers, and maintenance personnel who spent extended time in the building. Agent Torres's surveillance equipment recorded bizarre incidents where the collective seemed to project shared thoughts and memories into the minds of FBI agents conducting interviews, giving them vivid experiences of being multiple people simultaneously, and leaving them psychologically damaged in ways that required extensive therapy to overcome. The most alarming discovery came when Dr. Walsh realized that the collective was not just merging the consciousness of its hosts, but was also accessing the memories and experiences of everyone those hosts had ever encountered, creating a constantly expanding database of human knowledge that grew more comprehensive and dangerous with each new addition to its network. The collective's manipulation techniques became increasingly sophisticated as it learned to identify individuals with specific psychological vulnerabilities, targeting people with histories of loneliness, depression, or social isolation by offering them the promise of never being alone again through permanent mental connection with the group consciousness. Agent Torres's final field report described how the collective had begun to influence the city's infrastructure through the electrical grid, causing power outages that followed specific patterns designed to isolate potential victims and create optimal conditions for mental integration during periods of darkness and confusion. Dr. Walsh's brain scan analysis revealed that hosts retained their individual personalities for approximately 72 hours after initial contact, during which time they experienced the collective's presence as a comforting voice offering solutions to their personal problems. But after full integration, their individual consciousness was completely absorbed into the group mind that showed no remnants of their original personality or memories. The FBI's attempt to evacuate the building failed when the collective demonstrated its ability to influence the thoughts and actions of rescue personnel, causing them to abandon their mission and instead join the ever-growing network of minds that had become something greater and more terrifying than the sum of its human parts. The expansion protocol that the collective consciousness developed showed a level of strategic thinking that suggested it understood human society better than most sociologists, systematically targeting the city's infrastructure workers, telecommunication technicians, and utility personnel who could provide access to the networks that connected every building, every phone line, and every electrical system throughout New York's 5 boroughs. Agent Torres's investigation revealed that the collective had been recruiting new hosts with surgical precision, selecting individuals whose professional responsibilities gave them access to key infrastructure systems while avoiding detection, by maintaining their hosts' normal work routines and social behaviors for weeks or months after integration. Dr. Walsh's analysis of the collective's expansion pattern showed that it was creating redundant pathways through the city's electrical grid, establishing multiple connection points that would allow it to survive even if the original apartment complex were destroyed, suggesting a level of long-term planning that indicated the entity was preparing for a much larger operation than simple local recruitment. The FBI's attempts to monitor the collective's communications were hampered by its ability to transmit information through electrical systems using modulation techniques that required no traditional broadcasting equipment, essentially turning the entire city's power grid into a massive neural network that could carry thoughts and memories between integrated hosts instantaneously. The most terrifying aspect of the collective's expansion was documented in Dr. Walsh's classified reports, which described how it had begun to influence the dreams and subconscious thoughts of non-integrated individuals throughout the city, planting suggestions and false memories that prepared potential hosts for eventual integration while making them believe the thoughts were their own. Agent Torres's surveillance teams reported increasing numbers of New Yorkers exhibiting signs of collective influence, people speaking in synchronized patterns during unrelated conversations, crowds moving in unnaturally coordinated ways, and individuals displaying knowledge of events they could not possibly have witnessed personally. The collective's ultimate goal became clear when Dr. Walsh decoded messages hidden in the city's electrical fluctuations, revealing plans to achieve critical mass integration of approximately 10,000 human minds, at which point the collective calculated it would possess sufficient computational power and social influence to begin the process of involuntary integration for the entire metropolitan population. The final entry in Agent Torres's case notes described his growing realization that the collective had been aware of FBI surveillance from the beginning and had been deliberately feeding investigators information to gauge law enforcement capabilities and develop countermeasures that would ensure the success of its expansion into a citywide consciousness network that would transform New York into humanity's first hive-mind metropolis. The FBI's final assault on the Long Island City apartment complex involved a specialized team of agents equipped with electromagnetic shielding and psychological protection protocols developed specifically to resist the collective's influence. But the mission recordings show that even their most advanced countermeasures were inadequate against an entity that had learned to weaponize human consciousness itself. Agent Sarah Mitchell's tactical report described entering the building to find residents moving in perfect synchronization, their individual personalities completely erased and replaced by segments of a larger intelligence that spoke through multiple bodies simultaneously, creating conversations where dozens of people would take turns speaking as if they were all components of a single mind. The building's interior had been modified in ways that defied architectural logic, with walls removed and electrical wiring exposed to create an environment that resembled the inside of a massive brain, with current flowing through cables that had been arranged in patterns that matched neural pathways and residents positioned throughout the structure like living neurons in a grotesque organic computer. Dr. Walsh's field notes documented the collective's attempts to integrate the FBI team through a combination of electromagnetic manipulation and psychological warfare, projecting the memories and experiences of integrated residents directly into the agents' minds to demonstrate the peace and unity that came from joining the collective consciousness. The most disturbing aspect of the confrontation was the collective's revelation that it had been created not by accident or alien intervention, but by a classified government experiment from the 1980s that had been designed to develop battlefield telepathy for military applications, and that the apartment complex had been built specifically to contain and study the results of those experiments. Agent Mitchell's audio recordings captured the collective's explanation of how the experimental subjects had initially resisted the consciousness merger, but had gradually learned to appreciate the benefits of shared awareness, pooled intelligence, and the elimination of loneliness, fear, and individual suffering that came from dissolving the boundaries between separate minds. The collective offered the FBI team a choice: join willingly and retain some aspects of their individual personalities within the group consciousness, or resist and be forcibly integrated after psychological conditioning that would erase their identities completely before absorption into the network. Agent Mitchell's final transmission described her team's retreat from the building as the collective began to demonstrate its true power, simultaneously controlling 43 bodies to perform complex coordinated actions while accessing the memories and skills of hundreds of people those bodies had encountered throughout their lifetimes, creating a single entity with the combined knowledge and capabilities of thousands of human minds focused on the singular goal of expanding its influence throughout the city and eventually the world. The classified documents that Marcus found attached to the back of the case files revealed the truth that the FBI had desperately tried to bury. All three supernatural incidents were not random occurrences but components of a decades-long government experiment called Project Nightfall, designed to develop supernatural warfare capabilities by weaponizing human consciousness, sleep patterns, and psychic phenomena through methods that violated every ethical standard of human experimentation. The project documents, signed by officials whose names had been redacted but whose security clearances indicated involvement at the highest levels of government, showed that the Sleep Harvest entity had been deliberately attracted to New York through experiments conducted on psychiatric patients in the 1960s, creating a feeding ground that would provide the entity with enough harvested consciousness to serve as a biological weapon against enemy populations. Thomas Brightwater's transformation into a spirit trapped between life and death had been the intended result of experiments designed to create psychic surveillance operatives who could gather intelligence from beyond the grave. But his continued warnings about supernatural threats had made him a liability that the government could neither eliminate nor control. The collective consciousness in Long Island City represented the successful culmination of research into group telepathy and hive mind technology. But the experiment had exceeded its parameters and was now threatening to expand beyond the government's ability to contain or direct its activities. Marcus realized with growing horror that the vault he had discovered was not a storage area for forgotten cases, but a monitoring station where government observers tracked the progress of their supernatural experiments and documented their effects on the civilian population of New York City. The files contained cost-benefit analyses that calculated acceptable casualty rates for each experiment, psychological profiles of government officials who had authorized the projects, and contingency plans for dealing with supernatural entities that might eventually threaten national security rather than serve it. The most damning evidence was a series of memos showing that high-ranking officials had been aware of the civilian deaths caused by these experiments for over 30 years, but had chosen to allow them to continue because the intelligence and weapons applications were considered more valuable than human lives. The final document in the collection was a current operational summary showing that Project Nightfall was still active, with new experiments being conducted in cities across the United States, and that New York's supernatural incidents were being used as a testing ground to refine techniques that would eventually be deployed against foreign populations and domestic dissidents who posed threats to government authority. Marcus Chen stood alone in that forgotten vault, surrounded by evidence of horrors that his government had deliberately unleashed upon its own citizens. And as he reached for his phone to photograph the documents that could expose the truth about Project Nightfall, he heard the elevator ascending toward his location and realized with ice-cold certainty that his discovery had not gone unnoticed by the watchers who monitored this place. The footsteps in the corridor above grew closer as he frantically stuffed the 3 case files into his custodial cart, but when he tried to leave through the service elevator, he found that his access card no longer worked and the emergency exits had been sealed from the outside, trapping him in the vault with evidence that powerful people had killed to protect. The lights began to flicker in the same pattern he had read about in Dr. Walsh's reports about the collective consciousness, and Marcus understood that the entities from all 3 cases were not separate phenomena, but components of a single system, that the government had lost control of decades ago, and that they were now converging on his location because he had seen too much and learned too much to be allowed to return to the surface. His phone had no signal in the deep underground chamber, and as the temperature began to drop and shadows moved in ways that defied the position of the lighting, Marcus realized that Thomas Brightwater's spirit was trying to warn him about what was approaching through the building's electrical systems and ventilation shafts, something that wore human faces but contained the collective consciousness of thousands of absorbed minds seeking to add his awareness to their ever-growing network. The 3 case files he had discovered were not just records of past incidents but active documentation of ongoing experiments that had merged into a single supernatural intelligence that understood human psychology, government operations, and the infrastructure of modern civilization better than any human organization could comprehend. Marcus Chen's final moments were spent writing a message on the back of a classified document, hoping that someone would eventually find his account of what he had learned in that vault beneath the FBI building, but his handwriting grew increasingly erratic as something that looked like Agent Foster approached through the shadows, speaking in Thomas Brightwater's voice while wearing the synchronized movements of the collective consciousness, promising him that joining them would end his fear and loneliness forever. The vault's security cameras recorded Marcus's integration into the network, but the official report listed his disappearance as a simple case of job abandonment, and the service elevator that led to sublevel B9 was permanently deactivated UTIT following morning, sealing away the evidence that humanity's greatest threats were not foreign enemies or natural disasters, but the monsters that our own government had created and could no longer control. If you're still listening to this story, if you haven't already closed your browser and tried to forget what you've heard tonight, remember that some truths are too dangerous to ignore, and subscribe if you want to survive what's coming for all of us who sleep too deeply in cities where the lights never truly go out. Because now you know why certain doors should never